This is our second part lecture of the muscle system. We have looked at an introduction to muscles as far as the anatomy goes, how muscles are named, and learning a little bit about the importance of the muscular system and all of the functions that the muscular system provides. We have seen that there are three particular types of muscles. We saw that in histology. We saw it again in part one of this series. Skeletal, which we spend most of our time on here, cardiac, heart muscle, and smooth muscle. So what this chapter is mostly looking at, though, is physiology of the skeletal muscle and how the skeletal muscle actually works. So that's what I am going to be spending time on with this in this particular chapter. With as far as characteristics of the muscles go, we know that muscle is responsive to innervation. Skeletal muscle needs motor neurons innervating it to cause it to react. We know that muscle can contract. It also has the ability to go back to its original shape and structure, and even has some capability of being stretched. So we had looked at human muscles in histology under a microscope, looking at the fibers that make up skeletal muscle, and we know that it is striated, has these striations that are seen running perpendicular to the parallel muscle fibers. We see the nucleus here, and we know that it's under conscious control, or it should be under conscious control. We do know that there are connective tissues that support all this muscle, this special tissue that we call muscle, and we looked a little bit at the anatomy of those, which was really, we said, just for your information. As far as muscles being able to contract, I am going to actually tell you all a story that starts at the beginning, once upon a time, beginning, and then with each part of the story, the next part should make sense, because it will cause a reaction to occur with every one action will cause a reaction. So when you listen to this story, what you should be doing is writing down the events that occur, and then in your head as you're studying it, realizing that one event could only happen after the prior event had occurred. So it's very sequential how a muscle contracts and relaxes. There is a very sequential sequence that occurs, and there are a lot of things that occur that have to be in place for the muscle to properly contract and then relax. So the reason that it's important that you would be able to maybe recite the story or understand the storyline is that if any part of the story gets interrupted, or if there's a problem with any of it, it would mean that the muscle is not working. So to understand disease of the muscular system, the skeletal muscular system, you would have to understand this physiology of muscle innervation and contraction. And you would have to understand that if any part of the sequential sequence of sequential part of the story is interrupted, then that's where the problem lies. In understanding that, we know then how to treat it. So this is the reason you want to be hopefully interested in this next part, which I'm going to be talking to you about, again, as a storyline. But there are a few things that you do need to know prior to me telling the story. And that's for skeletal muscle to contract. There are two major proteins that are responsible for the contraction. The two major proteins are myosin, which is a thick filament, and then actin, which is a thin filament. So actin. When you think about actin and myosin, I want you to think about them as almost like interwoven ropes. So you have this thick myosin, and interwoven between them is a thin filament called actin. And at rest, they're just sitting here minding their own business. But if a nerve innervates the muscle, then these two contractile proteins will move together and actually shorten or contract the entire fiber. That's what's unique, making muscle tissue unique, is the actin and the myosin and their ability to form these cross bridges that will cause them to pull the entire muscle fiber into a contracted state. So two contractile proteins, myosin and actin. And then there's also part of the story, I'll tell you these names now so it won't seem so foreign in the story. There are two proteins known as regulatory proteins, meaning they're going to regulate how often cross bridges can form between actin and myosin. These regulatory proteins are tropomyosin and troponin. Tropomyosin and troponin are proteins that are actually blocking binding sites on actin. So at rest, the reason a muscle isn't all contracted all the time is that troponin and tropomyosin are blocking the binding sites on actin at rest. And these two regulatory proteins would have to be acted upon to unlock those binding sites before actin and myosin could actually form cross bridges. Okay, so I just really wanted to talk to you about those 4 proteins before I tell you the story, okay? Again, 2 proteins related to contraction, that's myosin and actin, and then those 2 proteins that are keeping you from being contracted all the time, they're called regulatory proteins, troponin and tropomyosin. These are the major proteins related to a muscle contraction found within muscle tissue. So now what I'd like to do without any further ado is tell you a story. This story, by the way, is actually in your notes. I'm not making this up, the story up. This is actually a scientific theory called the sliding filament theory. But this story is actually written down for you in your textbook. So you do have reference to this. But I really want to tell it to you in a way that I think is a little bit not so textbook-like, okay? And I hope that you will think that it's making perfect sense when you hear about one thing happening, that it's cause and effect, that will cause or affect a change to the next step. And every one of these really are dependent on the one before it. So instead of memorizing something from a textbook, instead of memorizing that, because anything that would interfere with any one of these steps, remember, anything that would interfere with any one of these steps is actually associated with a very particular muscle disease or disorder. So I want it to make sense for you, okay? Now, so here I'm going to tell you the story, and I will go through it a couple of times, so I don't want you to think that you have to write it all. Well, you probably can in this format because you can just stop and start it. But I'd like you to hear it as a story first, a storyline, and then we'll go back through each of the steps. Okay, so let's take a look at this, and I will certainly use your resources here to sort of show you this. What I want you to be seeing here and having it make sense to you is, and you can see where my mouse is, all of this is the muscle cell, the muscle fiber. Okay, so this is the muscle fiber. This is the membrane. Sarcolemma is just the membrane, the cell membrane of the muscle. And these little areas are actin and myosin. Okay, so this is muscle. What you're seeing here is actually a nerve that is actually touching upon the muscle. A nerve. Completely different type of tissue. It's a nerve, right? But I'm going to go through this sort of fast, and then I'll come back maybe a little slower and show you in detail. So once upon a time, a muscle was being called upon to contract, maybe to pick up a coffee cup, okay, to have coffee, under voluntary control. For that to happen, for any muscle contraction to happen, and for every muscle contraction to happen, every step of what I'm about to tell you has to occur. Once upon a time, there was a motor neuron, a nerve, that actually sent a signal, released a neurotransmitter, released a transmitting molecule into a space that was between the nerve and the muscle fiber. That that neurotransmitter, that molecule, is called acetylcholine, ACH. As acetylcholine moved into the space, between the neuron and the muscle, it crossed the space. The space wasn't blocked. It was healthy. The space was clear. So it was able to move through the space and act on a receptor in the muscle membrane. This protein receptor, like a lock and key fit, the ACH was able to act like a little key in a lock and open up this receptor. When the receptor on the muscle membrane opened, sodium that is predominating outside of cells and in a huge amount compared to inside the cell, sodium poured into the muscle cell through passive diffusion. Didn't take any energy, just going down its gradient, diffusing into the cell. But potassium was in the cell in a predominant way. Potassium also has a positive charge. And when sodium rushed in with its positive charge, potassium rushed out. When they met at the membrane, when sodium and potassium met at the membrane crossing, it caused a millivoltage electrical shock to be sent throughout the muscle fiber. And all the membranes within the cell were affected by the shock, including the endoplasmic reticulum. The endoplasmic reticulum membranes in muscles store a mineral known as calcium. When the membranes got shocked because of the sodium and potassium crossing at the membrane level and that voltage rising, the endoplasmic membrane released calcium into the cell. Calcium flooded into the cell. When calcium flooded into the muscle cell, calcium acted on troponin and tropomyosin, making them move out of the way of the binding sites on actin. And when calcium moved troponin and tropomyosin out of the way, actin and myosin were able to form cross bridges, causing the entire muscle fiber to contract. The only thing that could break the cross bridges was actually a molecule known as ATP, an energy molecule. It was the only thing that breaks the cross bridges. So as ATP is breaking the cross bridges that have occurred, and as that is happening, that's controlling the muscle contraction, and that's an important part about the controlling, the relaxation. ATP is breaking those cross bridges. The acetylcholine is diluting out. It's being diluted out of the space and the synapse, which is called space. Enzymes called acetylcholinesterase, these are enzymes that act on acetylcholine, is breaking the acetylcholine down. The receptors are closing back on the membrane. calcium is moving back into the reticulum, the membranes, to be stored, and then troponin and tropomyosin are re-blocking the active sites on actin, and that's causing a relaxation. That's the end of the story. So for every muscle contraction, of which just me telling you that story and using my hand motions, it really took hundreds of that happening from the beginning to the end, an entire uninterrupted sequence. So I'm going to kind of go back through it a little slower. Not that any of you are excited about that, but I am going to go back through it a little slower and start again with this neuron where it is meeting the muscle fiber, the muscle. It's called a neuromuscular junction where they meet, and knowing that the first part of the story is a healthy neuron. Suppose someone had a nerve cut right here. Do you think this muscle fiber would ever be able to contract? No. That would be the end of the story before it even began. So there, that could actually cause paralysis. So again, let's look at the sequence though in a healthy situation, and then we'll come back and look at some things that go wrong here and actually can lead to muscular diseases. Let's think about healthy first. A healthy, functioning motor neuron, a nerve, is going to send a signal just from you thinking about it. It's going to release these little vesicles. It's going to release into a space called a synapse. This space should be clear. If it's blocked with something, it's going to interfere with how this ACH could be crossing the space and acting on receptors. So ACH will be produced by a functioning motor neuron. It will be able to cross a space between the neuron and the muscle. Of course, the space is microscopic, but it's still a space, and it still needs to be healthy. And as that, I'll go back to these pictures. So as that acetylcholine is going to end up acting on the receptor that's specialized, like a lock and key, a key and lock fit, it opens that receptor and sodium pours in. When sodium pours in, potassium will pour out. And what that is called is an action potential, or you could call it a shock, because it is a shock. A measurable voltage change, an action potential on the muscle fiber. That muscle fiber, the shock doesn't just stay right here. It moves through the entire muscle fiber. This endoplasmic reticulum membrane is storing calcium. But when it gets shocked, the calcium will flood out of the membrane into the cell. When calcium floods out, it acts on troponin and tropomyosin, moving those proteins away from the binding sites that they had been locking down on actin. Now, actin has its active sites open, so it can now form cross bridges with myosin, and when those cross bridges form, the whole fiber is contracting. And as that fiber contracts, pulls together, it's going to take ATP breaking those cross bridges. That's what it's going to take. So for relaxation, these cross bridges there has to be enough ATP for the cross bridges to be broken. Tropomyosin and troponin will move back, blocking the active sites. Acetylcholine out in the synapse will start to be broken down by an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, and it will be also diluted. The protein receptor will close back. so that sodium can't keep pouring in, and potassium is not going to keep pouring out. Calcium is going to go back to be stored for the next time you need the muscle to contract. It's going to be stored back into the endoplasmic reticulum for the next muscle contraction. It takes all of those steps for the relaxation. Those relaxation steps, ATP breaking the binding sites, acetylcholinesterase breaking down acetylcholine, protein receptors closing back, calcium moving back into the endoplasmic reticulum, the troponin, tropomyosin blocking the active sites on actin. All of those things have to happen for that relaxation phase, and that relaxation phase is just as important as the contraction. The entire story has to happen in a particular sequence. If you have something blocking the relaxation, then that's a problem too. If you have something blocking the early part where you can't get a contraction, then that's also a problem. So I have just gone through these steps, sort of breaking it down into hopefully less of a textbook type of literature that they have here, but I hope that it all makes sense, and you should really know the sequence, because that means that you would understand how muscles actually work, the physiology of muscles and how they actually work. Now, I want to talk to you now about some things that can actually happen and go wrong. So when we think about some disorders of this system, pesticides contain cholinesterase inhibitors, and they bind to acetylcholinesterase, and so they prevent it. They interrupt that relaxation phase. So what that causes is something called a spastic paralysis, meaning a continued contraction. And again, that might not sound like it's such a bad thing, but it can be deadly. It can interfere with breathing. We have to have muscles contracting and relaxing to be able to move air in our system. If we have to be able to open and close these muscles related to at the larynx and the voice box, or we can't move air. So this actually can be deadly, and it doesn't take too long for it to be deadly. There are some toxins that certain microbes, bacterium, produce, especially Clostridium tetani. Clostridium is the genus, tetani is the species. Tetani causes what we call tetanus, the disease called tetanus, or it's more commonly known as lockjaw, because the muscles in the face are the first ones usually affected. But there are certain numbers of deaths from lockjaw or tetanus every year, not as many in developed countries because of immunizations. Immunizations have saved countless millions of lives annually from diseases like this. But so in developed countries, we sort of have forgotten that and take it for granted. But the toxins associated with this bacterium actually can also overstimulate the muscles, causing what is known as tetany. And you all have seen that term, tetany, T-E-T-A-N-Y, means a sustained muscle contraction. The danger of tetany is that the person can actually suffocate. There's also flaccid paralysis, which means instead of having a constant contraction, you can't get a contraction. So it's floppy or flaccid. So flaccid paralysis is limp muscles, and this is because it's competing with ACH. So where you have these receptors, let's see if I can get a better picture. So where you have these receptors here, there's already something sitting there, so ACH can't come in and open the receptor because it's been blocked. So that's what's happening with some types of poisons, and then also some toxins associated with certain other bacterium. Clostridium botulinum which is a different type of Clostridium, a different species of Clostridium. Clostridium botulinum actually causes a flaccid paralysis. Its toxin paralyzes. You all have heard of the toxin associated with this bacteria, with this particular bacterium. You've heard it used in medicine, and it's called Botox. And it causes a paralysis, a flaccid type of paralysis. And it's a very potent, incredibly dangerous toxin if exposed to in the wrong way. Again, it can lead to suffocation. So these are some of the things that we associate with disorders. There's also an autoimmune disease called myasthenia gravis, and that there's a picture of somebody with myasthenia at the end of your textbook. But what happens with myasthenia gravis is that, again, the immune system interferes with acetylcholine. So instead of acetylcholine in this very early step, instead of acetylcholine being able to actually come and interact with this receptor, protein receptor on the muscle membrane, it's blocked. And so again, that ends up causing a flaccid type of paralysis, and that's an autoimmune disease. Maybe you can see we've already learned that calcium homeostasis, blood calcium homeostasis, is so important. So maybe for muscle contractions, so you can see in the steps now of skeletal muscle innervation just where calcium comes in and plays a role in unblocking those binding sites of that troponin and tropomyosin are blocking. So in unblocking those binding sites on actin so that actin and myosin can form those cross bridges. So calcium homeostasis, this is where it comes into play in muscle innervation. So you all have also probably heard of rigor mortis. That is something that happens after death. This happens in every animal after death. The hours that it happens and how it peaks and how long it takes to go away depends on the environment. So whether it's really warm environment or cold or wherever the body may have been, it sort of can vary. These hours can vary. But what will happen after any death of any animal is that after a certain period of time, the body will go into what's called a rigor, which is a sustained contraction. The reason that it goes into rigor is because the endoplasmic reticulum starts to break down inside the muscle fibers. Sarco is just a prefix we associate with muscle, but it's the same as saying endoplasmic reticulum, which you all learned as an organelle in your cytology study. This breaks down and calcium starts to be released in the cell. The muscles didn't get a memo that you're dead. So it really doesn't matter. The calcium is still going to interact with troponin and tropomyosin, and you're still going to get the cross bridges. But what happens when you get those cross bridges is that now you're not making ATP because you're not breathing. And for ATP, you remember you have to have oxygen. So you're not making ATP, so nothing's breaking the cross bridges. The reason that the cross bridges eventually break after a certain amount of time is that they just break down on their own after a certain period of time. So then you have gone through what is considered to be full rigor mortis. So this is why that is happening, how it happens. So really, the whole first part of this chapter is all about physiology of skeletal muscle and how skeletal muscle is actually functioning and what it takes from beginning, once upon a time, until the end. And every one of those steps are crucial in the step that happened prior to it. I hope you saw that. I hope you saw that it was only when a motor neuron produced acetylcholine, and acetylcholine being able to move through the space and act on a functioning receptor that opened, causing sodium to pour in and potassium to pour out, causing a shock to be sent. The shock caused the calcium to be released. The calcium being released caused the troponin and tropomyosin to move away from the active sites on actin. so that then actin and myosin could form the cross bridges. The cross bridges could break because of ATP. The cross bridges could remain broken as long as calcium moved back into the endoplasmic, sarcoplasmic reticulum, and acetylcholine could be diluted and even broken down with acetylcholinesterase in the synapse to make one complete cycle. So this is what is needed for a muscle contraction. And again, they are listed in steps here for you, and I hope that it kind of made sense. And understanding that you really need to understand muscle physiology, you'd have to know each of these steps sequentially and how they actually are functioning. Now, there are different types of muscle contraction. There's isometric contraction, which means that you're actually having you're having contraction without changing any length. And then there's an isotonic contraction, which means that the tension is going to either cause a shortening or a lengthening. So these are just two terms that are used for muscle contractions. You should know the gist of those. Isometric, no real, if I told you to go move your wall with your hands, just go stand at the wall and push it over a foot, you wouldn't be able to do it. But anyway, it wouldn't mean that your muscles weren't contracting, they are. But isotonic means you're actually seeing visible movement. Now, ATP production. ATP production, we get the most of our ATP production from aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration was that equation I had you learn a little earlier in the semester. If you have glucose and oxygen available to your cells, inside your cells, you can make plenty of ATP. ATP is our charged batteries. It's our currency for the cell. It's our power molecule for the cell. It gives energy to do work. So it is by far and away the biggest supplier of ATP. Now, as far as muscles go, we have the ability for short durations, to actually go into something called anaerobic without oxygen. That's what that means. Fermentation. So we can sprint enough to maybe get up a hill from a bowl. I had to do that one time, and my dog saved me actually, but I was sprinting, believe me. Still, my dog saved me. And then you're out of air, so you're panting to try to replace the oxygen. But you can do that for short periods of time, and you're really not using aerobic respiration. You're using anaerobic fermentation, which doesn't give us enough oxygen. That's why you can only do it for short periods of time. It does produce lactic acid, anaerobic fermentation. So if that's being produced, this is something that the tissues are going to have to get rid of. And this is typically why people feel very sore after doing strenuous exercises or exercises that put them into anaerobic fermentation, because they built up lactic acid in the muscles. So sometimes you don't even feel that soreness until maybe hours later, the next day or the day after that even. But you'll have to get rid of that lactic acid because it's a toxic buildup. We have in our muscles stored glucose, glycogen. I've already mentioned that already in the system. We also have a storage molecule for oxygen, not just for glucose, but for oxygen, and that's called myoglobin. Myoglobin is a protein that can help us to store some oxygen in our tissues so that we can use that in these extreme situations. So myoglobin and glycogen are storage forms for aerobic respiration, and even when we have to go into anaerobic fermentation for short periods of time. So fatigue is, I think everybody understands what fatigue is, but here's a definition for you: just the progressive weakness or loss of the ability to reach a full contraction strength. Skeletal muscles can fatigue, and if they are overused or misused or whatever, you can get even complete skeletal muscle failure. I wouldn't recommend it. I don't think any physiologist would recommend it, or physical therapist would recommend it, but they can be fatigued over time. We can build skeletal muscle, so the actual muscle fibers themselves enlarge. The number of cells don't really enlarge, but the muscle fiber itself can enlarge. So people who are doing weight training, or athletes, their muscle, that whole saying, use it or lose it, right? But they can enlarge. This is that word myoglobin I just told you about. Okay, so exercise is important. As I said, use it or lose it. There are different types of theories on how people should train, whether training with weights or endurance training for the vascular system, cardiovascular system as well. But anyway, just different training techniques, but we should all be moving. We are actually made to be moving. I say that as a hypocrite because I'm not moving enough. But we understand that keeps the muscles functioning. Now, this was all related to skeletal muscle physiology. But we said there's also a couple of other types of muscle, and I do want to, even though we talk about these in later organ systems, we have an entire unit on the cardiovascular system and especially the heart. So, but I want to give you a couple of differences between cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle, and smooth muscle, the differences between that and cardiac and skeletal muscle. So we'll just learn some of these basic differences, okay? Cardiac muscle obviously is found only in the heart. It's heart muscle. On histology, it looks different. The fibers actually look different, and there are a couple of things that we note that are major differences. When we think about the calcium in skeletal muscle, it was being stored in the endoplasmic reticulum. But in cardiac muscle, it really is going to rely more on extracellular fluid. So again, another incredibly important reason for blood calcium levels to be maintained in the system, because imbalances can lead to arrhythmias. Arrhythmia means without rhythm. We don't want our heart working out of rhythm. We want it to be very rhythmic. It actually is built in to be rhythmic, have certain sinus rhythms, because that prevents it from becoming tired and fatigued. So that rhythm, heart rhythm, is actually important. We don't want anything interfering with that. Now, damaged cells are repaired in the heart muscle are repaired through fibrosis, which means scarring, not mitosis. In skeletal muscle, depending on the extent of the injury, skeletal muscle can repair as long as the injury is not too, egregious, as long as it's not too awful. But they can repair, but not cardiac muscle. So it scars. So we really don't want anything damaging the heart muscle. We also know that the heart muscle is autorhythmic. It has a group of cells called the pacemaker cells. These cells are found in a very particular area called the SA node. I think I'd already given you this too, but I'll give it to you again. This stands for sinoatrial node. That's what that stands for. These are a little group of cells found in that upper chamber of the heart, the right atrium. That's why this is atrial. And it is the pacemaker cells that are sending off an electrical signal that causes the sequence that's going to happen that causes the muscle to contract. It's not relying on motor neurons. It's autorhythmic. It also is influenced by many other hormones. So the pacemaker cells are, SA node is not the only thing that causes your heart rhythm. It can be influenced by many other hormones. You know that because if you're ever afraid, what happens? Your heart speeds up, doesn't it? Contraction strength gets harder as well. So these are some major differences in cardiac muscle versus skeletal muscle. And in cardiac muscle, we can't go into anaerobic fermentation. You've got to have a constant blood supply. This is why if the blood vessels that nourish the heart, which are called coronary arteries, become blocked and you run out of oxygen, red cells bringing oxygen to the tissues, it causes a myocardial infarction, which is what people call a heart attack. The fibers themselves have very large mitochondria and numerous mitochondria because it helps to resist fatigue. So these are very distinct differences between heart muscle and skeletal muscle, and ones you should know at this time. Now, smooth muscle is found, we said, surrounding vessels and surrounding some body organs, and these are going to be innervated by, again, calcium coming from extracellular fluid. So these are going to be innervated mostly by the endocrine system and hormones. So hormones innervating the smooth muscle that controls organ volume. So we know that. Now there's some disorders too. You have a disorders table and some deeper insights in this chapter that you will look at before you take a test on this. But as far as lecture quiz goes, I do want you to know about these few that we have mentioned in these last two talks on the muscle system. I had already previously mentioned myasthenia gravis as being autoimmune, where there are antibodies that are interfering with those receptors on the muscle membrane so that ACH can't work. So the story ends almost before it begins. The motor neuron's working, acetylcholine's being produced, it's crossing the synapse, but then it is blocked at the muscle membrane level, at the receptor level. Now, like with most autoimmune diseases, you can have some people who have very mild symptoms and rarely come out of remission. But then you can have other people that it can be really serious and acute in its presentation, meaning the symptoms come on quickly, they are serious, and they can even be life-threatening. So this causes, it can interfere with the muscles in the face, causing the eyes to not be able to track. It can cause the lids to droop. People can have trouble swallowing. They can have trouble with their upper limbs, and it can even lead to problems with the muscles for respiration, leading to respiratory failure. As with many, not all, but many autoimmune diseases, women are more often affected, and this is typically the ages when it starts. Now, here's a picture. I sometimes dislike pictures because they can show you the exaggerated versions of this, but this is a picture of not only the lids, but the eye not tracking, as it were. Many patients start off with symptoms so slowly, it might just be something to do with swallowing, or just being tired or whatnot. So it's not always an easy diagnosis. Like with a lot of autoimmune diseases, it can take a while. There's also an inherited group of disorders, these are inherited, that lead to something called muscular dystrophy. There are more than, the last time I looked at the muscular dystrophy site, there were more than 9 different types of inherited forms of muscular dystrophy. But by far and away, the most common form is a sex-linked disorder, which you all know that means that the information, the faulty information, is on that 23rd pair of chromosomes, and it's located on the X chromosome. And you all know that males only get one X, one chance at that. So it's usually in males, and it's due to a disorder found on the X chromosome that they inherit from their mother. And it has to do with making a faulty protein of dystrophin. This dystrophin is not functioning the way that it should, and either in the absence or the incorrect recipe for this, it leads to torn membranes, and over time, the child at first is beginning to do things as they should, but then it will start to decline. The muscle ability will start to decline. They're usually in a wheelchair before they're teenagers, and they rarely live past the age of 20. So this is still a devastating disease. It can have, as I said, there are other variants of it, but this is the most common thing. I have had a couple of females in my courses that had muscular dystrophy, that it was actually only isolated and located to the face and shoulder muscles, and it was not affecting the other muscles. So there are other types other than this, but this is the one you typically hear about as far as muscular dystrophy goes. Now, again, there's a disorders table and deeper insights in these two chapters, Chapter 10 and Chapter 11. I hope you've enjoyed learning about the muscular system. Our next system is the nervous system, and I look forward to helping you all with that, hopefully. So anyway, stay well and enjoy.